Today on the Continuum, we have the story of Nicolae Ceaușescu, Romania's dictator, and we have a conversation with Scarlett and the crazy parallels we're seeing with the United States. This is the Continuum. The winter of 1918 was harsh in the small village in Romania. Snow lay thick on the ground, and families huddled around meager fires in the wooden cottages. In one such cottage, Nicolae Ceaușescu was born, the son of poor peasants. His early life was defined by hunger, labor, and a rigid sense of hierarchy. Life was hard, but it left an impression on him. Survival required cunning, ambition, and ruthlessness. As a boy, he worked in the fields alongside his father and brothers. He watched his wealthier neighbors hold gatherings in their large homes, enjoying food he could only dream of. The seeds of envy and desire for power were planted quietly, unnoticed by the villagers. As Romania industrialized, young Nicolae found the Communist Party appealing. Promises of equity and justice spoke to a boy who had only known deprivation. By the mid 1930s, he was a teenage activist, distributing pamphlets, attending secret meetings, and learning the art of subversion. Arrests followed. Nicolae was sent to prison multiple times, enduring harsh labor and beatings, but these years hardened him. He began to understand a central truth of politics. Fear is as powerful as admiration, and loyalty can be bought or coerced. Behind the scenes, he made connections that would later be invaluable. Fellow prisoners, party comrades, and ideologies who admire his determination became his network, a web that would sustain him when he rose to power decades later. By 1965, after years of political maneuvering, Nicolae Ceaușescu became the general secretary of the Romanian Communist Party. At first, Romanians were cautiously optimistic. The memory of Stalinist purges were still fresh, and people hoped for reform. Ceaușescu spoke of independence from Moscow, promising a Romania that could chart its own path. He presented himself as modest and approachable. State media ran stories of him visiting factories, meeting peasants, and listening to the concerns of children. His wife, Elena, was portrayed as an accomplished intellectual, though in reality, her education was limited. Together, they became the perfect image for a devoted, modern ruling couple. But the image was carefully crafted. Propaganda painted Ceaușescu as omniscient, infallible, and indispensable. Newsprinters printed his speeches in full. Schools taught songs in his honor, and murals showed him towering above workers and peasants alike. Citizens were encouraged, subtle at first, to idolize him. Portraits adorned every public office, even schools, every town square. Children were asked to recite loyalty oaths. The cult of personality was not by accident. It was Ceaușescu's calculated strategy to turn admiration into obedience. Behind closed doors, decisions were centralized in a small circle. Dissenting voices were silenced before they could gain traction. The very network he had built in prison now ensured that his rule would face little challenge from within the party. To outsiders, he was a visionary. To those who worked closely with him, he was often petty, paranoid, and obsessed with control. His desire for recognition extended beyond Romania. He craved visits with Western leaders, speeches before international audiences, and media covers that praised his policies. Yet, when the world saw progress, Romania already felt cracks beneath the surface. The seeds of suffering were sown in silent homes, in the rationed foods of markets, and in the whispering fear of those who had suspected that the man they were told to admire might not have their best interest at heart. Ceausescu's rise was not sudden. It was the result of decades of cunning, ambition, and manipulation. The boy from a little small village in Romania had learned early that power could be captured, loyalty could be engineered, and that fear could be wielded like a weapon. By the mid 1960s, Romania was ready to witness a decade by decade transformation under a man whose hunger for power would soon overshadow the needs of the people. Bucharest, 1968. Wide avenues lined with brand new buildings gleam under the sun, while street vendors sold fresh produce from carts. On the surface, Romania looked like a nation on the rise. Factories belched smoke in the distance, and the state media broadcast Ceausescu's vision, a modern, industrialized Romania that could rival the West. Ceausescu borrowed billions of dollars from Western banks. He presented these loans as investments in the nation's future. Giant factories, hydroelectric dams, and industrial complexes were constructed across the country. At first, the projects seemed to promise jobs, growth, and a new sense of national pride. Citizens who visited the factories were shown gleaming machines, rows of workers in clean uniforms, and production quotas exceeded. But these were carefully staged snapshots. What the cameras didn't show was the harsh reality behind the walls. In reality, the borrowed money often went straight into the pockets of the party elites. Contracts were awarded to loyalists rather than competent engineers. Factories were built in locations far from raw materials or skilled labor, making them inefficient. These industries were created with no particular purpose, serving more as propaganda tools than economic engines. Workers were pushed to impossible quotas. Machinery often broke down due to poor planning or lack of maintenance. Citizens labored long hours in unsafe conditions, yet bonuses were distributed only to party favorites. Meanwhile, Ceausescu and Elena traveled the world, visiting Western capitals and representing Romania as a shining example of communist success. Behind closed doors, they dined with important dignitaries, wore designer clothes, and accumulated wealth far beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. Outside the factories and construction sites, life for ordinary Romanians was a daily struggle. Markets were poorly stocked, and basic necessities like meat, sugar, and flour were limited. Families had to ration food carefully, often boiled cabbage for weeks at a time. Mothers whispered warnings to their children not to talk about shortages at school. Neighbors traded goods quietly, in secret, to avoid drawing attention of local authorities. The disconnect between the progress Ceausescu promised and the daily reality was growing wider every year. One factory worker, Anna, wrote in her secret diary, "The television shows endless praise of the great leader. But at home, my children cry for bread. How can we live in a country that is supposed to be rich, yet gives us nothing?" The regime amplified its control through propaganda. Every success, real or imagined, was broadcast. Every hardship was hidden. Schools taught children that Ceausescu's vision was flawless, and that any complaint about shortages or inefficiency was unpatriotic. Even committee events were tightly controlled. Workers' committees reported not only on production, but on political loyalty. Letters of complaints were monitored. Whispers of dissent reached the ears of the Securitate, the secret police. Fear and admiration existed side by side, creating a society that appeared compliant, yet was quietly simmering with frustration. By the late 1970s, the illusion of progress began to crumble. Factories produced little of value, and the economy faltered under the weight of the loans and mismanagement. Citizens felt the effects in their homes. Shorter supplies of heating fuels, longer lines for basic goods, and he sensed that their labor was benefiting only the elite. Yet, Ceausescu remained blind, or perhaps indifferent. He publicly boasted about economic independence, never acknowledging the struggles that were becoming impossible to hide. His obsession with appearance outweighed the reality that people were starving while he flaunted wealth and power. The late 1960s and 1970s in Romania were a study in contradictions. On one hand, the world saw a leader promising modernization and industrial might. On the other, millions of Romanians enduring long workdays, empty shelves, and a growing sense of despair. Ceausescu's reign was beginning to reveal its true nature: progress for propaganda, suffering for people, and wealth for the dictator. The cracks in his empire were small at first, but they were growing, and people started to notice. The late 1970s brought back a stark reality to Romania. Ceausescu had borrowed billions from Western banks, and now the country's debt had ballooned. Instead of restructuring or easing the burden on citizens, the dictator devised a radical plan: repay every cent of Romania's foreign debt as quickly as possible. The plan was ambitious, ruthless, and catastrophic for ordinary Romanians. Factories ramped up exports, not to meet domestic need, but to generate foreign currency. Crops were sent abroad, oil, grain, and even everyday industrial goods vanished from local markets. Romania was technically fulfilling its promise to foreign lenders, but at the cost of its people's survival. By the early 1980s, Romania was a nation living under constant deprivation. In small villages and cities alike, families stood in dawn-long queues for sugar, flour, and meat, often returning home empty-handed. Cooking oil was rare. Milk was a luxury. Hospitals ran out of medicines. In Bucharest in 1982, Elena, a mother of three, described her daily reality in a hidden diary. The children are pale and weak. I beg the shopkeeper for bread. Sometimes we wait for hours. Sometimes we leave with nothing. How is it possible that we are hungry while our country is supposed to be strong? Electricity was rationed. In the dead of winter, entire apartment blocks went without heat. Candles and stoves fueled by wood became essential. Hospitals improvised with blankets and shared beds for patients suffering from cold, hunger, and illness. Even for those who had jobs, wages did not match the skyrocketing difficulty of daily survival. The promise of industrialization had turned into an endless struggle for bare necessities. Ceausescu monitored Romania's debt payments obsessively. Weekly reports from the financial ministry detailed every exported ton of grain and every barrel of oil shipped abroad. To him, appearances mattered above all. The country could not appear indebted. Foreign journalists were shown carefully staged factories and bursting ports, never the empty markets or the frail children in the streets. Meanwhile, the government demanded every citizen endure increasingly hard atrocities. Housewives learned to make meals from cabbage leaves, to turn old bread into porridge, and to stretch meat scraps into soups. School cafeterias served watery soups, often leaving children hungry after lunch. Workers in factories sometimes fainted from exhaustion or hunger, but production quotas were still in force. Sacrificed for the nation became the regime's mantra, an ideology that justified the suffering of millions. Hunger was compounded by fear. The Secretariat, Ceausescu's secret police, watched every aspect of life. People whispered complaints in private, but most dared not speak publicly. Informants lived in every neighborhood. Neighbors reported on each other. Children learned to praise the dictator at school while hiding their family struggle at home. One former factory worker, Ion, recalled, we were told to be grateful for what we had, but we had almost nothing. If you complained, even to a friend, you could be arrested. We lived in constant fear and hunger. That was Romania. The regime's control was absolute. Every failure, every famine, every empty shelf was hidden behind a veil of propaganda. Ceaușescu's speeches were broadcast nationwide, filled with boast about Romania's independence and prosperity, while reality grew bleak with each passing day. The Hunger Decade left deep psychological scars. Families struggled to hide the severity of their deprivation from one another. Parents rationed food to protect children. Children cried silently in school from malnutrition. Communities fragmented under pressure. Yet, amidst despair, a quiet resilience emerged. People shared what little they had in secret. Farmers hid portions of their crop to feed neighbors. Housewives traded goods discreetly. In whispered conversations, citizens began to notice the absurd contrast between the dictator's luxury and their suffering. This growing awareness planted seeds of discontent that would later fuel the revolution. The 1980s were a decade of engineered suffering. Ceaușescu's obsession with debt repayment created a society where every citizen was forced to sacrifice for the illusion of a strong, independent nation. The rich and the powerful lived in luxury. The factories produced for export, and the people endured hunger, cold, and fear. Romania's paradox was stark. While the world saw a leader boasting of economic success, his citizens were starving under a regime obsessed with appearances. The cracks were widening, and the people's patience was thinning, and the seeds of revolution, planted in whispers and ration lines, were beginning to take root. Bucharest, 1984. At the heart of the city, bulldozers tore through historic neighborhoods. Entire blocks of homes, centuries old churches, and schools vanished in days. Families were given hours, or sometimes mere minutes, to gather their belongings before their houses were reduced to rubble. This devastation paved the way for Ceaușescu's crowning achievement, the Palace of the People, known today as the House of the People. Intended to be the largest administrative building in the world, it was a monument to Ceaușescu himself, a palace that declared his vision, power, and vanity. The scale was staggering. Marble from Italy, crystal chandeliers from Austria, and grand staircases imported from France were all brought in. Every detail screamed opulence. Yet every brick was laid while Romanians outside were starving and freezing in their homes. Tens of thousands of families were forcibly removed from their homes. Many lived in crowded apartments or with relatives after losing everything. Children lost their schools, and elderly citizens lost the neighborhoods that they had lived in for decades. One former resident, Maria, recalled, "We were told to leave immediately. Only the belongings we could carry were allowed. Our home, the place where my children were born, it was gone in hours. We were nothing to them, nothing at all." Workers drafted for the palace's construction labored under brutal conditions. Many endured 12 to 14-hour shifts, often without proper nutrition. Because food was being exported abroad, some collapsed from exhaustion, injuries were common, and safety regulations were ignored. Yet, no one could complain. The Securitate ensured compliance through fear. Inside the palace, Ceaușescu and his inner circle hosted lavish banquets. Imported wines, delicacies, and fine silks were the order of the day. Extravagance in the palace contrasted violently with the daily life of ordinary Romanians. In apartments across Bucharest, families huddled under blankets, rationing fuel for cooking, and ate watery soups to survive. Candles flickered as children struggled to do homework in near darkness. Heating was restricted in the winter. Power outages were common. One teacher described the contrast. Every day, we saw the same news reports praising the palace, praising the great leader. Meanwhile, my students came home from school weak from hunger. Every brick of that building felt like a slap in the face to the people like us. The Palace of the People was not just a building, it was a statement. It demolished Ceaușescu's absolute control and his obsession with imagery. To him, it was a sign of Romania's greatness. To the people, it was a symbol of cruelty, theft, and indifference. Every room, hallway, and marble column represented the suffering of those who were displaced, the food that never reached the population, and the forced labor of countless workers. It was grandeur built on blood, fear, and hunger. By the mid 1980s, the contrast between the dictator's life and the population's misery had become impossible to ignore. Even in the safest whispers, people spoke of the injustice. How can he eat caviar while my children cry for bread? How can he live in the warmth while we shiver in freezing apartments? Rumors of hidden wealth, secret escapes, and luxury trips fueled anger. The palace became a tangible reminder of everything wrong with the regime, a visible monument to Ceaușescu's greed. Even the party loyalists began to question priorities. While they could not speak openly, the seeds of dissent were quietly spreading among workers, neighbors, and families displaced by the construction. The Palace of the People was Ceaușescu's dream realized, a testament to his vanity and obsession with control. But behind its marble walls and glittering chandeliers lay the suffering of tens of thousands of Romanians, families displaced, children malnourished, workers exhausted. The place stood as a monument to corruption and the human cost, a symbol of the vast divide between a dictator and his people. By the time the palace neared completion, the nation's patience was fraying. The people could no longer ignore the stark inequalities, and the contrast between the opulence and the deprivation fueled the quiet anger that will soon ignite into revolution. Romania, 1985. Streets in Bucharest are quiet, but silence often means fear rather than peace. Every office, factory, and neighborhood has hidden eyes and ears. The Secretariat, Ceaușescu's secret police, maintained one of the most intrusive surveillance networks in the world. Neighbors report neighbors, coworkers report coworkers. Even children are encouraged to praise the regime and alert authorities to any sign of disloyalty. A casual complaint could be interpreted as treason. A whispered criticism could lead to arrest. Fear was the invisible infrastructure of Ceausescu's dictatorship. Inside apartments, families learned to whisper. Conversations in the presence of strangers were rare. Letters are censored. Phone calls are monitored. Rumors of arrests spread like wildfire. No one knew who might be listening, who might report, who might disappear. Elena, a seamstress in a Bucharest factory, remembered, I never spoke of my struggles openly. My neighbors had vanished after complaining about food shortages. We whispered, and even then, we felt the walls listening. Fear permeated every layer of life. Citizens grew accustomed to secrecy, learning to hide complaints, ration not only food, but words. Even at early age, children were taught to revere Ceausescu. Schools displayed portraits of the dictator and his wife. Curriculum included songs and essays praising his leadership. Students learned to report disloyal classmates. Even playtime had political undertones. Children were asked to memorize party slogans and demonstrate loyalty in competitions. At home, parents struggled to balance protecting their children and surviving under the constant gaze of the Securiat. The regime's control was psychological as much as physical. People learned to self censor, hiding dissent in both speech and thought. Those who dared to speak out faced harsh consequences. Writers, journalists, priests, and ordinary citizens were arrested, interrogated, and often imprisoned in harsh conditions. Some were tortured, others disappeared entirely, leaving families with nothing but silence and uncertainty. Workers, like Mihai, who tried to complain about the unsafe factory conditions, recounted, the Securiat came to question me. They asked me about everyone I worked with, everyone I talked to. I was released after days, but I knew they would watch me forever. Fear became part of life. Even private dissent became dangerous. Rumors, journals, and secret meetings could be interpreted as threats to the state. In a society built on mistrust, solidarity was difficult to achieve. Surveillance wasn't just about control, it shaped daily survival. People adapted, families hid extra food, citizens whispered about shortages, trades, and secrets in code. Farmers smuggled small portions of grain to feed neighbors. Teachers passed notes quietly in classrooms. The nation's fear extended to every social interaction. Trust became scarce. Loyalty was often performative. But amidst the repression, small acts of resistance and solidarity persisted. People found ways to survive, to help each other quietly, and to maintain some humanity in a system designed to strip it away. By the mid 1980s, the contrast between the state's propaganda and daily life had become impossible to ignore. Citizens knew that the grand speeches, glowing television reports, and the portraits adorning schools were lies. The palace, the parades, the accolades, they belonged to the dictator and his inner circle. Rumors circulated. The elites lived in luxury while the majority froze in unheated apartments and scavenged for food. Fear persisted, but so did simmering anger. The surveillance network could enforce silence, but it could not erase the collective memory of suffering and injustice. By the end of the 1980s, Romania had become a nation under permanent watch. Fear, surveillance, and psychological control were tools of oppression as effective as rationing food and forced labor. But people endured hunger, cold, deprivation, but the ever present eye of the security ensured that anger stayed hidden. Even so, the seeds of discontent were growing, quietly nurtured in whispers, in hidden journals, and in shared understanding of injustice. A nation may be silent under fear, but fear cannot indefinitely ease the longing for freedom and justice. Romania was on the edge, and the cracks in Ceausescu's iron grip was widening. By the mid 1980s, Romania was a nation stretched to its breaking point. Hunger, cold, and deprivation had become daily realities. Ration lines grew longer. Electricity shortages were constant, and hospitals were overwhelmed. Even for those who still had jobs, wages did little to ease suffering. Yet, the regime continued its facade. Ceausescu's speeches boasted of economic progress, while state media flooded television screens with images of smiling workers and thriving farms. The people, however, had begun to notice the stark contradiction. In quiet whispers at home, in dimly lit kitchens, and in hushed conversations in factories, citizens shared their frustration. He lives in luxury, while we freeze, they said. He eats imported food, while our children go hungry. These small murmurs, once easily dismissed by fear, began to coalesce into growing, quiet discontent. The first sparks of resistance emerged in local communities. Workers in factories began to slow production or call in minor sick days as subtle protests. Farmers hid small portion of grain or refused to meet impossible quotas. University students and intellectuals circulated clandestine writings criticizing the regime's failures. In Timirosos, a city in western Romania, unrest began to simmer. Citizens grew emboldened by small acts of defiance. The oppressive surveillance and the fear that had long suffocated voices could no longer contain every spark of dissent. On December 16, 1989, events escalated. Authorities attempted to forcibly evict a Hungarian pastor, Lazos Tokes, who had once openly criticized the regime. Residents of Timirosos protested, initially in small numbers, demanding justice for the pastor. The regime's response was brutal. Military and police forces opened fire on demonstrators. Civilians were killed in the streets. But instead of quelling unrest, the violence ignited nationwide outrage. Citizens realized that fear could no longer silence them. The small local protests quickly snowballed into citywide rebellion. Ordinary Romanians, teachers, factory workers, students, took to the street to resist not just the eviction, but years of starvation, fear, and oppression. News of the protests spread rapidly, even though the regime tried to suppress it. Citizens in other cities began demonstrating, chanting slogans that were unthinkable weeks before. Down with Ceausescu, we want freedom. Every element of the army and the police began to question orders. The loyalty that Ceausescu had relied upon for decades began to fracture. Rumors circulated of defections, and for the first time, the people sensed that the regime was vulnerable. Ceausescu, oblivious or unwilling to face the reality, attempted to maintain control. He delivered speeches to the nation, calling the protests the work of foreign agitators, and asserting that Romania was strong and united. But the people could see the truth with their own eyes: empty shells, freezing apartments, starving children, and soldiers refusing to fire on civilians. The once imposing image of the dictator was crumbling in real time. Citizens whispered to each other, "We've waited too long. This is our chance. We cannot fear him anymore." The cracks in the regime's armor were no longer hidden. Fear still existed, but hope, long buried under oppression, had begun to resurface. By late December 1989, Romania was poised on the edge of revolution. Years of hunger, surveillance, and corruption had left the population desperate for change. The protests in Timisoara were more than a local uprising. They were the spark that revealed the fragility of Ceausescu's iron grip. For the first time, ordinary citizens realized that the dictator could be challenged. The seeds of rebellion, sown through the decades of suffering, were now ready to grow. Romania had reached a tipping point. The stage was set for the confrontation that would shake the nation to its core. and bring the dictator's rule to a sudden and violent end. The streets of Bucharest were tense, yet electric. Citizens whispered excitedly about the protest in Timisoara and dared to hope that change was possible. Security forces patrolled cautiously, aware that their loyalty was weakening. Ceaușescu, still blind to reality, took to the stage to address thousands from the balcony of the Central Committee building. The cameras broadcasted the scene nationwide, intending to project control. Instead, the crowd erupted into boos and jeers. The unthinkable act in a nation long silenced by fear. The dictator's face, once always composed, betrayed confusion and anger. He shouted into the microphone, attempting to regain authority, but the chants of "Down with Ceaușescu" drowned him out. The illusion of his omnipotence shattered before millions of eyes. Spurred by the television humiliation, Romanians poured into the street. Workers, students, and families braved the tear gas and sporadic gunfire to demand the dictator's removal. The army and the police, uncertain of their orders, increasingly sympathetic to the population, hesitated and eventually switched sides in many areas. For the first time in decades, ordinary citizens felt power in their own hands. Mothers carried children past barricades. Elderly men waved their fists at tanks. Students lifted place cards demanding justice, freedom, and the end of starvation and fear. One protester, Nicolae, recalled, "We had been silent for so long. We had endured hunger, cold, and the endless lies of the regime. That day, something inside of all of us changed. We shouted, not just for ourselves, but for every Romanian who had suffered." Realizing that control was lost, Ceaușescu and Elena fled Bucharest in a helicopter, attempting to regroup at a military base. For a brief moment, the nation held its breath. But the escape failed. The couple was captured by revolutionary forces within hours. They were isolated, interrogated, and confined in a safe location. Rumors of their fate spread quickly, fueling hope and tension across Romania. Citizens waited anxiously, unsure whether justice would come swiftly or if the dictator might regain power. On December 25th, 1989, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu faced a hastily convened military tribunal. The charges were severe: genocide, corruption, abuse of power, and crimes against the people. The trial was short, lasting just a few hours, but the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses recounted decades of suffering, forced labor, food rationing, executions, surveillance, and mass evictions. The verdict was inevitable. Both were sentenced to death. Outside, crowds gathered, awaiting news. For many, it was not about revenge. It was about closure, justice, and finally reclaiming a nation that had been stolen from them. That same day, Nicolae and Elena were executed by firing squad. The shots rang out, echoing across the nation. Citizens celebrated in the streets, not with joy over violence, but with the relief that the source of decades of suffering was gone. Children who had grown up in fear, families who had starved, and communities who had been displaced witnessed a turning point. Romania's nightmare under Ceaușescu had ended. One survivor, Anna, reflected, "We cried, we shouted, we hugged strangers in the street. It was not happiness, it was freedom. Freedom from fear, hunger, and tyranny." In the days following the execution, Romania faced chaos, looting, unrest, and uncertainty marked the immediate aftermath. But the revolution had also unleashed hope. Citizens began to reclaim public spaces, reopening markets, and rebuilding communities destroyed under decades of oppression. The fall of Ceaușescu symbolized the triumph of the people over absolute power. It demonstrated that even the most oppressive regimes, sustained by fear, hunger, and surveillance, could not endure when the citizens found courage and unity. The fall of Ceausescu was swift, dramatic, and inevitable. Years of corruption, greed, and oppression had created a brittle empire, held together only by fear. When the people finally rose, they shattered that illusion of invincibility. The dictator's end was both a moment of justice and a symbol of liberation. Romania had survived the nightmare of a regime oppressed by power, vanity, and control. The streets were now theirs, and a nation now long silenced began the arduous journey to rebuild, remembering the suffering but determined to reclaim its dignity.
Let's get into it because this is a great way to start. When I was writing the story, I'm looking at things and I'm like,
Yeah,
wow, that is so much like what's happening now.
it is. Um, you know, the people's house, when we talk about the White House, we talk about that as being our house.
Yeah,
Um, when I personally think about it, I think about it as being a building that was built on stolen land by stolen hands.
yeah,
I personally think that it has never represented what it should represent. I personally feel like it has never been a beacon for all people in the way that it should have been a beacon for all people,
yeah.
regardless of where they came from.
When I
Okay.
was when I was
Okay.
listening though to that people's house, because he talks about the
Yeah.
people's palace, and
Yeah.
it kind of reminds you of like Trump trying to build this massive ballroom, but yet people in
Right.
the U.S. were having major food uncertainty and all that, but he's spending $200 million
Right.
on a ballroom and all the
Right.
gold.
Right. So we're going to be making massive upgrades to a building that, again, for me, has never stood for what it's supposed to. So instead of fixing what's wrong in the country, we're taking more money that we could be putting to actual use for the people who have always been underrepresented.
Yeah,
And we're using that money in a gaudy and showy exercise of power, what, to emulate Putin? To emulate these other dictators that he seems to fawn after, to just like the dictator in Romania, to impress these international people, to give this show of riches and power.
yeah,
It's a mockery. It's an absolute mockery of the hard work that everyday Romanians, in our case, everyday Americans, put in. And when you read in your story, when the people in Romania start to realize what's happening beyond the veil,
yeah,
when that veil starts to tear for them, and they realize that all of these things that are being shown on state media are not representative of them. I'm not seeing that in my real life. I'm only seeing that on this screen. And it makes me think of the everyday, ordinary Americans now who are finally starting to wake up a little bit
oh yeah,
and
I didn't
kind of, yeah, to me, I can take your entire story and pick it apart layer by layer, not just the people's house, not just the ballroom, which I know was the whole point of our conversation, But if you pick it apart layer by layer by layer, the parallels are extremely eerie. Um, and I think as if he goes through with it, if he goes through with this ballroom, if nobody stops him, I think you're going to see the very same things, even within his own quote followers, start to happen,
Yeah.
where they're going to be losing food stamps, right? They're going to be losing their Medicaid, their Medicare. They're going to be losing educational rights for their children in some cases. Yet he's building this gold ballroom to show off again, as we said, to who? Who is that really for? Is it really for the people? Because I don't see any people served by that.
Yeah. And we saw in the story, like, Ceausescu in Romania, he was so focused on trying to get approval from like foreign leaders and foreign television and all that. And like his own people, he completely threw to the wayside.
100%. As soon as you mentioned that, I literally thought about, in my opinion, the dishonor and the disgrace done first by the hands of the American soldiers forced to roll out that red carpet for Putin, but then by the disgrace to the entire Alaskan nation and the indigenous people still living there by calling that Russia.
Oh yeah, that's yeah,
There are so many layers here of disrespect and disregard for the people he is supposed to be representing, all in the name of showing off to his bestie.
yeah. It's all for a foreign leader, which it draws right back. But then like I was
Yes.
reading more into this when the people finally started to figure it out and like turn on him, and people started like
Yep.
taking sick days randomly from work, and I really started. I looked at that and I was like, oh, like
It's it's so mind-blowing, the parallels. I could read your script that you sent to me and I could listen to you talk on that story, I'm telling you, a dozen times and find new, extremely uncanny parallels. And then I thought actually about two professors. I won't share their names out of respect, but they moved here to my area from Romania
mm,
because, and what are we seeing happen in our country now? This purge of academics, the silencing of academic voices, and in some cases, them moving out of our country for safety of their own craft, right?
yeah,
And it's ironic to me that you and I are having this conversation, and that a decade ago, I met this Romanian professor and his wife, who is also a professor, who had moved here when all of that was happening. And I've spoken with both of them extensively about why they left Romania because of the crackdown on intellect and academia.
oh yeah, for
And
sure.
I never would have thought that you and I would have been having this conversation a decade later. So the fact that you asked me to speak on this, it just all the little things that tied back. They actually went back for a couple of years here recently for like a professorship
Okay,
there.
yeah,
Um, and then they're back now again. But because they are trying to continue to give back to their home country in ways that they can. But interestingly enough, just like we've seen people here in this country, those two people have said very specifically, we don't feel safe though to go back permanently. Still, years after the execution of their dictator,
yeah,
they still don't feel safe. How interesting that is. We're having people in this country leave and saying, we'll never feel safe to go back.
Yeah, that you see it there. Like Romania still struggles because of what happened,
Yes.
and people are still like they still struggle to have high top end like professors or intellectuals. They don't have a huge like science community like they once did before, and it's the guy's been gone for almost 50 years now. So you see how much that hurt them like for such a long period of time.
And we've been saying this, you and I, others have been saying this, it's going to take decades to undo. And we are only 8 months in, and it's
Right.
going to take decades to undo. So it's, again, those parallels. What's interesting too is the woman in this husband wife team. If you want to take a wild guess at what she teaches art as a
Mm.
form of resistance. That's her whole specialty,
Oh,
which right now is incredibly apropos.
yeah. I mean, we saw like in Florida they removed that the rainbow sidewalk. I mean, that's art that's used as a statement of
It is
like,
art.
and they
Yep.
removed the Black Lives Matter plaza. That was all art.
Yep. It's
Like,
all art. Did you see the news regarding um, outside of the Pulse Hotel or the Pulse nightclub? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to misspeak there. I saw some video today, and there was a highway patrol officer on one side, intimidation, so they don't repaint it. And on the other side, I saw a lovely human using chalk to make new things right outside of the nightclub. Um, I know it's only chalk, but I thought, how brave. There's that highway patrolman whose one job has been to intimidate
people, yeah, to not,
from recreating the art.
yeah,
But that human is still there, even if just chalk, to create art, to say, hey, I'm still here and I'm not going anywhere and you're not scaring me away.
yeah. And in the story, like
Um,
you see that he uses intimidation through his like secret police force all the time, and now we're kind of seeing it
yes.
here.
Yeah, when you mentioned in the story about neighbors telling on neighbors and children telling on children and all of the different examples that you gave, I thought very specifically of the hotlines that they have set up to turn people in, the flyers that we have seen been put up to turn people in. And again, just like so many points of your story, I can go, well, then this is what's happening here. And that's what happened then. And this is what's happening now. It's how other people don't see the signs is beyond me. Even if you don't know the story of Romania, how do you not see the issue with these kinds of things popping up? How do you not see the red flags, the writing on the wall, so to speak?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of people just don't realize it, and they do it. It's not just happened in Romania. Same thing happened in
No,
Germany,
agreed.
Italy, Russia. Like it's the same playbook. It's just nobody really noticed.
I think that you could take this same script, but as you said, change the country and write the same play by play of how that one person rose to power, how they took down an entire system, how they suppressed an entire people. Um, and then I think you could take and draw the same parallels. I think that's also why, in one sense, Trump wants to create this ballroom, because if we look at the pictures that we have seen from Russia, it looks the same as what he's trying to build in our people's house. It's the exact same. All of the gold, the opulence, the overabundance, this showy environment that he's wanting to create. It is. nothing to do with our country and the greatness that he thinks he's going to be rebuilding, and everything to do with impressing these other leaders in cementing his own power, in paying homage to him own self.
Yeah.
I mean, because as you mentioned, the portrait issue, think about the portraits that he has removed from places of honor in the White House and what he's replaced them with,
Oh yeah. He's
the wall of merch.
the wall of merch. He has those. They're all like AI photos too that he's put up and stuff like that. It's all about
Yeah.
him just making himself seem more grandiose. It's not about actual ruling or actual being a president or any of that.
No, agreed.
So I thought
Agreed.
that was
Um,
very parallel.
yeah, it really is. And you know, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know if this ballroom is going to happen. I know that's the plan. I know that's steamrolling full ahead in his brain, right? Um, and amongst his little lackeys there.
Yeah,
But if it does happen, I think it's going to end up whatever time frame ahead of now, the same thing as a museum of what should never have happened. An example of how not to behave, an example of how not to lead.
I
Um, and I think if it does happen, um, it's going to continue to rip the veil for people who haven't seen it rip yet.
yeah, I
And I think some people's rose-colored glasses are going to start to fade.
yeah, especially as things get harder economically, because I think that's one parallel you see a lot is
Yes.
economically the countries always start to suffer,
Yep.
but the dictator at the top always tries to live in a luxury that the normal citizens looking at like, wait, we're struggling, but you're just taking our money to live luxury. And I think that's what people
Yeah.
are seeing.
Well, you mentioned in the story about how individual citizens had to very quietly, mind you, I have this, you have this, let's share. You know, that community bartering that they had to start to do to survive.
Yeah,
Um, I think you are going to see that here. I think you are already starting to see it here. I had a conversation maybe a month ago with a young mom who lives 2 blocks down at the next crossing from me. And we are already discussing our gardens for next year. And we've decided that we are going to coordinate with what she grows and what I grow. So that, for example, if she were to plant, you know, a whole row of cucumbers, I'm not going to plant any cucumbers then. If I plant a whole row of okra, she won't. That sort of thing.
yeah,
And then we're going to combine the resources and then divide so that we both have what we need. We discussed the importance of probably developing community resources even for grain conservation because we may start to see an issue with that. And we discussed the importance of possibly like buying whole grains and then learning how to grind them and then distributing flour amongst families who need it. And well, that's us thinking about next year, about what we might need to start thinking about to prepare. And I think that you are going to start seeing that happen more and more and more. You can make soap. Okay, I can't, but here's what I can do for you.
yeah. I completely agree. And they put such in the story. They put such an emphasis on he wanted production, he wanted manufacturing jobs, he wanted all this
Yep.
to meet high quotas and all that. But he didn't really talk about trying to pay those people or what that's
No.
do.
Well, and look at what the federal minimum wage. If you look, there's been some really interesting comparisons made to show how the salaries for our wealthiest people have continued to go up, how the wealth amassed by some of our biggest billionaires have continued to go up. Federal minimum wage hasn't.
Oh yeah, I think it hasn't gone up since probably the 50s. I think is when they said.
Yeah, it's still 725
Yeah, but the production of the work has
federally.
gone up by quite a bit. So
Correct. Correct. Um, and and I think the more these people are in charge, the more you're going to see them, even because of the technology we have now, discard the worker in favor of automated machines who can output more to clear that international debt, yet continue to dismantle the social programs to take care of that discarded worker.
yeah,
And then also blame that discarded worker for their poverty.
oh yeah. Speaking of the debt, he was obsessed with paying down the debt that he created, and
Right.
I was like, that is another parallel because Trump is already responsible for 21% of our national debt, and he's talking the tariffs are going to pay down the international debt. He wants to raise taxes on the lower class to pay down that debt. He's so obsessed with paying down this debt that he's not noticing the damage that was done. And the same thing happened in Romania. It was
Agreed.
all about paying down the debt without actually helping people.
Right. Because he's claiming that he wants to reduce the debt by, for example, initially using Doge to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. As you said, while he is creating waste, fraud, and abuse,
Yeah,
we're going to take away all these social programs, yet ramp up ICE to get rid of these undesirables, um,
in
which is
itself.
not helping the economy at
Yeah,
all because you're eliminating all of these people, which is going to in turn eliminate huge sections of our tax base, all in the name of eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse, in the name of removing people that are criminals, removing people that are taking away American jobs. And what do we see happening already? We see states like, um, was it Nebraska? I think there was a governor that was complaining that they don't have,
oh yeah, Nebraska. I'm
I
pretty
think it was
sure.
Nebraska.
Yeah, Nebraska.
Um, and you're going to start to see more of those states speak up
Oh yeah, Iowa.
and say, oh, wait. And I'm just sitting here every time I read one of those articles, I go, why are you confused?
You know exactly what happened.
Right. Like A plus B equals C here. And they either, and I'm not sure which is worse, they either are so stupid that they don't get it, or they do get it, but they don't want to admit they get it. So they're going to continue to divert the blame. I don't know which is worse
I
because
think
one is willful ignorance.
I think they're just toting that party line. They can't turn. But even when we he was overthrown, he blamed
Right.
foreign agitators
Yep.
and foreign influence and people paying these people. That's the
Yeah.
exact same thing that Trump's doing.
100%. He's doing the same thing because, I mean, look at what, wasn't it Stephen Miller last week that called the people in DC, old white hillbillies or something. I forget the exact phrase that he used, but,
Old white,
you know, something. Yeah. Old white hippies or something. Anyway,
old white hippies. I think
um,
that's what it was.
I think that's what it was. I've got my wrong H word there. He couldn't at all admit that, and let's not forget that yes, there are some of our elders who are out here in the streets protesting. So he's not totally wrong, but he's still wrong. You
Yeah,
know, yes, there are elder white folks out there in the streets protesting, but that's not the entire, swath of people there. And to label them all as that or as paid agitators, every time we have this massive protest like King's Day, instead of saying that no, King's Day was a success, oh, those were all paid agitators, those were all paid protesters, people paid them to go in and do that. I haven't gotten my check yet. I don't know if you have,
no,
but yeah, but I think that it's interesting when, instead of admitting that there are people rising up, these dictators time and again throughout history just accuse foreign agitators, and accuse them as being paid protesters. They did the same thing though during the civil rights movement. Southern governors said, well, this isn't really what people want in the South. Things are going just fine. It's just Northern agitators coming down to the South to cause trouble. They did the same thing then. The
yeah.
same thing.
Just like he's saying that it's Latin American and Hispanics who are coming to cause trouble. That's what they said
Right.
in Romania. That's what they said in Germany. All that. So,
Yep. All of it.
thank.
So,
I'll let you get going here, Scarlett. But thank you. I knew that this was a tough story for people to really dissect, and I knew you'd be the perfect person for it.
well, I appreciate it. It's an honor. I really appreciate it. I can't wait to see the final thing come out. I love watching each episode that you come out with. The way that you dissect history is so similar to how I dissect it. So the way your brain works is extremely fascinating to me. And we study, in some cases, different times of history, yet similar.
Yeah,
My focus of history was always 1984 to 1954 to 1985, and specifically the intersection of race and class in the American Southern geopolitical economy, which is not dissimilar from what you're doing or from what's happening now, but it's still a different time frame. And the same way that I break it down in my head and in my research is the way that you break it down. And I love the way your brain works. So thank you for the time that you put into it. It's not an overnight thing. It's not an instant
oh
thing,
yeah,
contrary to what some people might think. It takes a lot of hours and thought and reflection. So your work is appreciated and much needed right now.
yeah. Thank you, Scarlett. Thank you for coming on,
You're
though.
welcome.
I'm definitely gonna
You're
have to have
welcome.
you again
Absolutely.
because you are
Well,
so
thank you. Just let me
knowledgeable.
know.
Will do.
Well,
Okay.
thank you. I appreciate that. All right.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye, Scarlett.